It's
It's
history.
one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The events. The figures.
Not quite to the noise, man. It's over humanity. From this time and place,
I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The drama.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook.
Questions.
Well, I'm not a crook.
If we dig deep in our history and our doctrine, and remember that we are not descended from fearful men.
It's hardcore history.
Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Whom shall I be afraid?
What year did humankind acquire the capability to destroy itself? I think that's an interesting idea, isn't it? The idea that every civilization in the universe, if it continues to progress technologically down the road, will reach a period when it can kill itself, either on purpose or accidentally. This fits into something, some physicists' theories on what's called the Fermi paradox, and this idea of reaching a danger point in your civilization is called the Great Filter. The Fermi paradox is a famous paradox that was initially talked about supposedly by a bunch of the great physicists in the world on a lunch break, where they had done the math trying to figure out the possibilities of intelligent life being elsewhere in the universe, and the math is so overwhelmingly in favor of the idea that there must be. Right? There's hundreds of billions of stars in our galaxy, hundreds of billions of galaxies in the universe. It just seems like a slam dunk, right? So then Enrico Fermi, famously, one of the great physicists ever, famously then says to the group, so where is everybody? And that's the Fermi paradox. If the math says they should be there, but they're not there, what's the reason they're not there? And that's where the Great Filter comes in, because some of these people who study this stuff have suggested that there might be a point in every intelligent civilization's development where they acquire this ability to destroy themselves and have to get through the period where they have that capability and get to the point where they figure out how not to do that. And it's kind of like a pass-fail test for intelligent civilizational growth everywhere in the universe, and sort of by its very nature, most civilizations don't pass it. And so maybe that's the reason they're not all out there. And guys like Nick Bostrom, who study, global catastrophic risk and stuff like that, and, what if a comet hit the planet? What if nanotechnology goes out of control? I mean, looks at all these issues. He suggests that the Earth entered this civilizational phase, this Great Filter period in our own history, in 1945, when the atomic bombs were first used. Now, I think about this in terms of the First World War, because I think that's when people first realized that human beings had acquired a military capability that was frightening. Not frightening because your enemy had it, frightening because human beings had it. You can go back and look at history, and there are lots of times when people were afraid of the deadliness of weapons, but they were afraid of the deadliness of weapons either because they were afraid themselves of getting killed or their country of getting taken over or whatever. They weren't afraid for the species. They weren't afraid for civilization as a whole. I mean, the closest you'll see with that coming is you'll have like a Mongol invasion or invasion from the steppe, and it strikes the settled civilizations a bit like a wave, and it washes up a certain amount of civilization up on the beach, but it doesn't destroy everything. In the 19th century, that's the first time period where you can read writings from people who are asserting that maybe what they're developing battlefield capability-wise can destroy everything. Now, their version of everything is a little bit different than ours. When we talk about things like existential risk, we're talking about the survival of life on the planet. That's a post-atomic, idea of what existential risk means. We understand. You have a nuclear war amongst all the great powers, and you can kiss life on goodbye. Or certainly our level of civilization. You've heard that phrase, bomb someone back to the Stone Age? Well, we modern people have the capability to do that, right? But it was in the 19th century that the idea that that's what a major war between the major powers might amount to, that's when that idea takes hold. Those people are worried about definition number 2 of existential threat. You know, guys like Nick Bostrom have 2 definitions. One is the one we think about, wiped out life on Earth. But the other definition of what existential threat is being knocked back down a few rungs on your level of civilization and then never finding your way back to your former greatness. To have a Statue of Liberty in the sand moment, as I like to call it, where you look up and you see the Statue of Liberty like in the Planet of the Apes coming out of the sand, and you instantly realize in a blinding flash of light that you're living in an era that is off the civilizational highs. And that's what the people writing in the late 19th, early 20th century, especially in places like Great Britain and the United States, where everything seems just great. Why do we have to screw it up with a war and really nothing to gain and everything to lose? Those people are writing about living in a golden age that they believe is fragile, and that these giant war machines that are equally deadly in terms of their abilities to kill people on the battlefield, but also their ability to simply bankrupt the societies that have to maintain them, is causing consternation. And the very weapon systems themselves and the arms races that they're having create more opportunities for some sort of violent outbreak of war that will then see these things employed. The funny thing about human history, if you study military history, is that up until about 200 years ago, you can imagine armies from a very long time ago fighting and beating armies from not that long ago. I mean, Alexander the Great's army, I think, beats the Carolingian army of Charlemagne, which is, a first-rate army 1,000 years later. I don't think the Macedonians must their hair. I mean, there are books like Arthur Farrell's The Origins of War, where that credible historian can't help but play with the Battle of Waterloo, inserting Alexander and his Macedonians from the 330s BCE in the place of Napoleon and his French, sending the Macedonians up against the Duke of Wellington and his British and their coalition allies, and having Alexander and the Macedonians do at least as well as Napoleon. So what does that show you? Well, it shows you how all of human military history changes at about the time of the Napoleonic Wars, because all of a sudden a new law of historical nature takes over, which says that earlier armies do not beat later armies. And the rules changed 1,000%. First of all, think about today. If you took the U.S. Army from today, had it fight a battle against the U.S. Army of 1945, today's U.S. Army destroys that Second World War army, mid-20th century army, and maybe doesn't lose a man when they do it. But that 1945 U.S. Army would defeat easily any army from the First World War. Any army from the First World War of the major powers would easily defeat the United States in the U.S. Civil War. And those Civil War armies, if they went back to Waterloo, beat them. So that's sort of the rule of the law of technological battlefield development for the last 200 years. And that's what the people in this story have had to try to suck up and understand. In 1700, some ruler can decide on a new musket design and not change it for 100 years, and he's still probably okay. In the 19th century, if you miss 15 years of development in rifle technology, you might lose a war because of that. I mean, think about something like the naval arms races and how this just destroyed everybody's treasuries and everything else. But at the beginning of the 1800s, you were using ship-of-the-line type stuff. I mean, the same naval technology of giant wooden ships with cannons all in the side, that's been the way things have been done for a couple centuries. And when you build a ship and spend all that money and all that time, it's good for a long time. If it doesn't get destroyed in battle, that ship can serve you for 20, 30 years and just be fine. Great investment payoff over time. If you amortize the cost out over the decades, that goes away at the end of the 19th century, and yet the cost explodes. You look at a battleship from 1900, and it doesn't look like anything from Napoleon's time. It looks like a thoroughly modern battleship. The problem is technology is changing so fast now that in the time it takes you to design that new battleship, the 2 or so years it takes to build and launch and finish it, it may be outdated by the time it's ready to be used. You take a first-class, first-rate, fleet from a global power in 1914, and you pit it in battle against a first-rate, top-of-the-line fleet from a mere 14 years ago, and the one from 1914 destroys the one from 1900 and maybe doesn't lose a major surface vessel while doing so. That is mind-boggling to the people who lived back then, because that means if you can't keep up technologically with what your neighbor is doing at great expense, you can negate all the money you spent on that fleet in the first place. Better to not have that fleet from 1900 if you're just going to lose the whole thing and not even sink one of your enemy's ships. The need to keep up with the killing power of everyone else was impacting the treasuries of these countries in ways that created just as big of a threat to their continued existence as the threat of all these dangerous armies did. It was a catch-22 for them. Take the role that the Russian Tsar found himself in 1898, a guy named Nicholas II, maybe the single most powerful person on the planet. He's got a shaky regime. There's a lot of revolution, there's a lot of discontent, and a lot of it is exacerbated by the costs of trying to, keep up a modern military. And even with all these costs, he's falling behind. Russia's too illiterate. Its industries are too small. Its society still needs so much modernization before it can keep up with places like Germany and France and Great Britain and even the United States. The problem is that the Tsar's power is all in the country's size and the population. And that's becoming less and less important as technology begins to determine who wins and who loses battles. And that's being demonstrated all through the 19th century as these small colonial armies from the technologically sophisticated powers destroy sometimes giant armies of tribal natives all over the world. And that line, a famous one that says, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not," is about using machine guns on tribal peoples. The Russian Tsar is looking ahead and seeing that if he can't keep up with this technological arms race that seems to be never-ending and endlessly expensive, the Russians are just going to be the new tribal peoples. And that he has to have this modern military machine, because if his adversaries have it and he doesn't, he's going to lose any war he gets into. He loses his dynasty potentially either way. How do you get out of a mess like that? In 1898, the Russian Tsar thinks he finds a way. And he issues a public invitation to representatives from the other great powers who are, one degree or another, in the same boat he's into. No one knows what the next major war will look like, but everybody's had a chance to see some minor wars in the meantime, and if you sort of extrapolate what they were telling you, the next war is going to be horrifying. And Nicholas II was actually reading the guy who turned out to be one of the most accurate prognosticators of what the next war was going to be like. We talked about it in the last show, Ivan Bloch. Nicholas II is reading Ivan Bloch, and Bloch's predictions are horrific. So the Tsar wants out. He wants to figure out a way to stop this dangerous cycle that the modern world seems to be forcing all the great powers into. And I think it's a wonderful sort of commentary on the attitude of the times that these guys thought that they could do this. It looks like rainbows and unicorns to we modern people, but to them they must have thought reasonable people can sit down over cigars and whiskey, see this dynamic that we've got ourselves caught up in, realize that it's in no one's interest, and reasonable people can figure a way out of this. And in 1898, the Tsar of Russia proposed something that will be called the Hague Conference to deal with this. There are many ways to look at the 1899 Hague Conference, and there'll be another one in 1907, by the way. And truthfully, it looks like an early version of arms control agreements you will see throughout the 20th century, which you can also view through multiple lenses. The first one is you can take it at face value, the way the Tsar sold it. If you want to use modern terms, the Tsar's PR people, when he issues this invitation to the rest of the world leaders, couches this whole thing as a common-sense effort at a high-minded idea. He says the goal of this conference he wants to put together is, quote, "seeking to make the great idea of universal peace triumph over the elements of trouble and discord." And we might sell an arms control conference today like that. This is the era where we really see, for the first time in human history, the growth of what today we would call the international peace movement. It's had many conferences before the Hague Conference to promote these ideas, and there was a general feeling of progress on these issues. And so the Tsar may have been playing into that, although the Tsar was kind of an interesting dude. Very much a similar role on the monarchy dice as the Germans got with Kaiser Wilhelm. A very mediocre sort of guy, not the sort of person you could imagine ever getting this job if it were merit-based. He's the same Tsar, the last Tsar, by the way, who will fall victim and under sort of the sway of the person that is sometimes called the Mad Monk, Grigori Rasputin, although it's more interesting than that. Probably deserves more credit than that. But it kind of, again, shows you the Tsar as a kind of an idealistic, romantic... I mean, he might have bought into this stuff. It might be legitimate on the Tsar's part. But like most arms control agreements, there's a realpolitik side to this thing. The Tsar knows that his armies are falling behind in this technological race. The old line about arms control agreements is if you're losing an arms race, it's a good time to have an arms control agreement. And when the powers that are invited to this Hague Conference ask for clarification of what's on the agenda, the Tsar and his people give them 8 or 9 points that are going to be goals of the conference. And the 8 or 9 points to a 21st century mind are fascinating because it really shows you what the Tsar wants to come out of this conference. The Tsar's number 2 goal, for example, the agenda gives to the rest of the participants, says, quote, to prohibit the use in the armies and fleets of any new kind of firearms whatever, and of new explosives, or any powders more powerful than those now in use, either for rifles or cannon. End quote. Now, this is a staple to some degree of arms control agreements ever since. I mean, if the U.S. and the Soviet Union are having an arms control agreement or an anti-ballistic missile agreement or whatever, they may have rules on technological progress, but they aren't trying to stop all technological progress. What the Tsar wants to do is freeze things where they are. He doesn't want any more research to increase the killing power that already exists in militaries. He doesn't want any more deployment if you accidentally discover that new battleship gun that will shoot twice as far as your current one. You can't deploy it. He wants the size of armies frozen and then reduced. He wants the size of military budgets frozen and then reduced. This is a person who clearly shows that his main issue with the way things are is the pace of change, and he wants this conference to address it. Now, to modern people, who will often freak out if the promised phone upgrade that's supposed to be released today is late, the internet will blow up with angry people who have had their pace of change sabotaged. The people in the late 19th century can probably be forgiven for thinking something we would assume is impossible is possible. The first time I ever encountered this idea, by the way, was in James Burke's wonderful TV series from the 1980s, The Day the Universe Changed, where he asked the question, if humankind looks, down the road where a particular branch of knowledge seems to be taking them, can they decide if they don't like the destination to just not learn that branch of knowledge at all, or to wall it off so that no one learns it? To modern people, that sounds impossible. To people in the late 19th century, they would have been able to show you multiple historical examples where that had been done. The Catholic Church was very good at it in medieval times, for example. There have been Chinese emperors who could do it well. The idea of creating forbidden knowledge and then preventing people from having it or using it was not unusual in this time period. That's what the Tsar wants. He wants to slow or retard the pace of change. And I always try to remind myself how whipsawed all these people were in this time period by the pace of change, too. That's really what the 19th century is, the era where it all speeds up. If you could, for example, graph human technological progress the way you would a stock market performance graph, starting at the beginning of human history, ending yesterday, and having your ups and downs all throughout history, you'd notice a couple of things right off the bat. The first thing you'd notice is that there are ups and downs. One thing the modern mind seems to find incomprehensible is that progress ever moves backward. The people who lived in 1900, for example, were reading history books that made that sound like a historical law of nature. They had every reason to believe that the era they were living in might be the last of a golden age before a fall, because after all, that's what had happened to every other golden age that they look back on. The first thing the modern mind sees when it looks at the historical stock performance chart showing human technological progress is that there's a bunny hop sort of dynamic going on. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You might get a big upturn, when the New Kingdom Egyptians come on the scene, maybe another uptick when the Han Chinese arrive, another uptick when the Roman Empire arrives, but after your Roman Empire highs, you get your Roman Empire bubble, don't you? And a couple hundred years later, when it's gone, you have Germanic barbarians in formerly Roman territory looking up at crumbling aqueducts and wondering what sort of giants once roamed the earth that could build stuff like that. The first thing you're going to notice as a modern person is that technology doesn't always move forward. The second thing you're going to notice is that throughout most of human history, whether it's going up or going down, it's moving at a glacially slow pace. The amount of change from the beginning of time to about the Renaissance is nowhere near what you would expect if we were anywhere near the pace of change we have now. Very little overall growth until you hit the Renaissance, and then you see the rise. And then the century after that, a little bit more, and then about 1810, 1820, the graph becomes almost vertical overnight. It shoots up, and instead of ever plateauing, as we all know, it goes ever more vertical every day. Now, we're used to this because it's been going that way for a while. The Tsar's generation, that century, that's the first time it really takes off. And those people are looking at that as an extremely destabilizing force. The Tsar thinks perhaps an arms control agreement will help Russia from falling too far behind their more technologically sophisticated neighbors. Now, as you might expect, their more technologically sophisticated neighbors see this as an artificial constraint on the fact that they're winning. Take the Germans as a perfect example. A people who are trying very hard to make up for what they see as the rest of the powers treating them like dirt. They're the ones building more ships than anybody and trying to catch up to Britain. They're the ones modernizing their military every day. They're the ones who, instead of being panicked by the pace of change, are taking advantage of it. To them, this looks like an agreement that will lock in their inferiority. And by the way, that's a situation that will repeat many times after this period in arms control negotiations, trying to gain an edge on your opponent. If you are losing the arms race, as I said, good time to have an arms control agreement. Finally, there's an interesting group of people, and they really don't exist anymore, not openly, that are on the opposite side of the ledger from, say, the international peace movement that's, ramping up during this era. The people who think that war is a good thing. Forget about international, goals or realpolitik. People that literally believe that humankind thrives on war and that without war, we will drown in materialism. The only thing that keeps us focused on the higher things. That's an idea that has sort of gone by the wayside in Western culture. Today, it's peace activists who argue against, realpolitik people. In the 1880s, for example, you have guys like the elder Helmut von Moltke who tries to explain to people why peace is not even a good idea. You're deluded. He said, quote, "Perpetual peace is a dream, and not even a beautiful dream. And war is an integral part of God's ordering of the universe. In war, man's noblest virtues come into play. Courage and renunciation, fidelity to duty, and a readiness for sacrifice that does not stop at giving up life itself. Without war, the world would be swamped in materialism." Others will point out that if you decide to try to make war, a thing of the past, what happens to all those people that are in situations where, they're struggling against foreign oppression, for example? Are you going to tell someone they can't free themselves from a horrible oppressor because, violence is bad? But finally, you also have the people that the modern peace activists would recognize very well. Those who adhere to a belief system that is difficult to argue with in terms of, historical proof. If you're going to use history as your guide, you're going to argue that the best way to keep the peace is to be so strong that it is almost suicidal to fight with you. Best exemplified, perhaps, by British Admiral Sir John Fisher, who tries to explain to a friend of his that when he sounds horrific, he's really an advocate of peace. And he said, quote, "I am not for war, I am for peace. That is why I am for a supreme navy. Did I not write in your autograph book at The Hague, the supremacy of the British Navy is the best security for the peace of the world? My sole object is peace. What you call my truculence is all for peace. If you rub it in, both at home and abroad, that you are ready for instant war, with every unit of your strength in the first line, and waiting to be first in, and hit your enemy in the belly, and kick him when he's down, and boil your prisoners in oil, if you take any, and torture his women and children, then people will steer clear of you. Well, as harsh as that is, it has a certain amount of historical evidence to back it up, doesn't it? When asked how to make war more humane, the nephew of Helmut von Moltke the Elder, that would be Helmut von Moltke the Younger, the field marshal in charge of Germany's war effort at the start of the First World War, famously said the only way to make war humane is to make it short. Hence, the Schlieffen Plan. We talked about this so-called Schlieffen Plan in the last episode. It's the almost mythological pre-war plan of how Germany was going to deal with this terrible two-front problem. My analogy is like a bar fight. Isn't there a meme online that I saw comparing World War I to a bar fight? But it's a little like, Germany knows it's going to have a bar fight with France and Russia, but they know that France is going to be there 5 minutes before Russia, so they get to the bar right on time, knock France out, and 5 minutes later when Russia shows up late, they get to fight the Germans one-on-one. That's the war plan in a nutshell. But the questions surrounding this war plan have become maybe the number one most controversial issue that historians argue with each other and froth at the mouth over. And yours truly, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm just going to sit back, eat popcorn, and watch the very entertaining discussions on the so-called Schlieffen Plan, because it's not just a this or that. It's like a Kennedy assassination thing, where, every different theory you can think of is out there. There was a Schlieffen Plan. No, there wasn't a Schlieffen Plan. There was a Schlieffen Plan, but it was modified. Modified by Moltke. Why not call it the Schlieffen-Moltke Plan? It just goes on and on and on. And the people often on multiple sides of this issue are very credible. So I'm not getting, it's like trying to bring in on a discussion with scientists. You just have to sort of watch sometimes. So I'm not going to take a position on this so-called Schlieffen Plan, and we'll call it the Schlieffen Plan because that's what everybody knows it by. But suffice it to say this. Schlieffen's retired for quite a long time before the First World War breaks out, so whatever plan the Germans were going to use are in the hands of Helmut von Moltke the Younger, the guy who's leading this whole, early war on the Germans' part. He's been the one designing this plan for a long time. After the First World War is over, you will get a bunch of German generals writing memoirs, sort of castigating this Moltke guy, for deviating from Schlieffen's amazingly brilliant plan, is the way it was pronounced. If you had just stayed with the plan the way it was supposed to be, we win the war. And so it's worth talking about the plan a little bit. From a military history standpoint, the Schlieffen Plan, and again, I have to say, as it's normally understood, because somebody out there is going to have a very good piece of evidence showing it was totally different than I'm saying right now. But as it's commonly understood, the Schlieffen Plan is a fantastic military gamble. It involves taking troops from basically everywhere else you might have to fight and taking as many of them as you can and sticking them on that one part that's going to be the sledgehammer, the head of the sledgehammer. And your superiority in numbers at the head of that sledgehammer is going to be so overwhelming it's going to crush everything. And then you can swing it around and trap all the French armies that are sitting on the French border, waiting to fight the Germans on the other side of the German border, but the head of the hammer's coming through Belgium, a neutral country. It's going to swing from above, and then it's going to collapse down on all those French armies facing the Germans and trap them in the rear. But it's a huge gamble. What if you screw up? What if the Russians mobilize faster than you think they're going to? Well, they'll be mowing down your tiny little forces left there to stop them, and they're not that